Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this evening's webinar. We are excited to have you here for this informative session about an important clinical trial that Neuma Pharma is conducting on the use of Besimglurant to manage pain in patients with trigeminal neuralgia. Whether you're someone directly impacted by facial pain or simply interested in learning more, we're glad you've taken time to be here with us this evening. My name is Brandy Underwood, and I serve as the Manager of Development, Research, and Advocacy for the Facial Pain Association. And I'm excited to share some updates from the FPA. October is Facial Pain Awareness Month, and we invite you to join us as we share facts about facial pain and lift the voices of our community by sharing stories and promoting grassroots awareness events. Throughout October, we will be hosting educational webinars, starting with a path to pain relief, featuring Dr. Raymond Sakula, the FPA's Medical Advisory Board Chair. I'm also pleased to announce that the FPA will release its second book, Facial Pain: Living Well with Neuropathic Facial Pain, including Trigeminal Neuralgia, on October 1st. You can be one of the first to know when the book is launched by joining our mailing list. Visit www.facepain.org to subscribe. Now, it is my honor to introduce two expert speakers and a special guest from Neuma Pharma, who are here with us today. Dr. Rob Lasser, Chief Medical Officer at Neuma, Rob Silva, Vice President of Clinical Science, and Denise Bedoya, Director of Clinical Operations. Dr. Rob Lasser is a seasoned biopharma executive with over 25 years of experience in the CNS space, spanning clinical practice, academic research, large pharma, and biotech. He currently serves as the Chief Medical Officer of Neuma Pharma, with a focus on developing new therapeutics for trigeminal neuralgia. Rob Silva received his PhD in neuroscience from the City University of New York and is a seasoned clinical stage pharmaceutical development leader with over 20 years of industry experience. And Denise, will you please share a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Brandy. We're excited to be here. I'm Denise Bedoya. I'm one of the directors of clinical operations at Neuma Pharma, and I've been in clinical research over 20 years. Started obviously when I was very, very young, and have worked across the board at sites, CROs, and now at the sponsor level. And I work very closely with Dr. Lasser and Dr. Silva on the trigeminal neuralgia study. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, Denise. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions for our presenters, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will have a dedicated Q&A session at the end, but please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation. We also encourage you to connect with other attendees using the chat feature. And as a reminder, today's webinar will be recorded and available on our website in approximately 1 week. Again, we are thrilled to have you here with us this evening and hope this session provides valuable insights. Without further ado, let's get started. Dr. Lasser, Rob, Denise, please take it away.
Thank you, Brandy. Let me just put the slides up first. All right, excellent. So, Rob, you want to kick it off? Let me just take care of the disclaimers first. So, the Libra study that we'll be talking about today has been reviewed and approved by the FDA and, of course, central ethics committees. The information would rather limited in terms of the actual data, but it comes from presented scientific congresses or other publicly available websites. Besimglurant, remember, is an investigational drug. That means there is no current marketing authorization or for any indication, and it cannot be used outside the context of these pre-approved clinical trials and under the surveillance of the participants' study doctors. I forgot to include you, unfortunately, Denise, but myself, Rob Silva, Rob Lasser, and Denise Bedoya are employees of Neuma Pharma AG, and we are, of course, a proud sponsor of the FPA. So I think we're going to turn it over to Rob to give us a little background on the on Noema, and take it away, Rob.
Oh,
You're on
Rob,
mute, Rob.
Dr.
Sorry.
Lasser, I apologize. You're muted. And Rob,
I'm
if you
muted,
wouldn't
yes.
mind, under slideshow, hitting play, it'll make it full screen, please,
Okay.
at the top.
Yes. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Voila. All right. So again, I just wanted to thank everybody as well for joining. I hope that we have some good questions as well. I'm going to just set up the background of Noema so you understand who we are as a company, and then Rob will take us through some of the details about the molecule that we're studying, Besimgluran, as well as the clinical trial. So we have 4 molecules. I'm trying to make this big enough so I can actually see it as well too. We have 4 molecules that we study here at Noema. These molecules actually came to us well studied initially because they're all molecules from Roche, a very large, well-known Swiss pharmaceutical company. These medications were, in some cases, tried in other disorders, did not seem to help those. But through additional experiments, certainly have found that other patients could potentially gain benefit from these treatments that Roche was no longer interested in developing. The first one we call NOE for Noema 101. As you know, that is also the name for Besimgluran. It works through a unique mechanism of action, different from anything that's available for trigeminal neuralgia, through a pathway called the mGluR5 pathway. It dampens or is a negative allosteric modulator, NAM or NAM, for the mGluR pathway system, and Rob will go into that a bit more. But in our work with 101, non-clinically, so these are on animal experiments and models of both pain and epilepsy, we found that Besimgluran actually had some beneficial effect in both of those models, and there were numerous ones in both pain as well as a specific type of epilepsy through a mutation, which is called tuberous sclerosis complex. So that's the first one that's listed up here on the slide. It's undergoing a large double-blind study, much like the trigeminal study, and it is looking at patients who have tuberous sclerosis complex. These are patients who often have seizures in childhood and then have to deal with resistant seizures throughout adulthood as well. It's also an orphan disease, like trigeminal neuralgia. The second program that we're here to talk about today and focus on will be the Besimgluran program in trigeminal neuralgia. You'll see that we use a design that's very much endorsed by both patients and the large community at hand. And important to note that the FPA and many patients through the FPA have had input into the study as well. And Rob and Denise can both give you that perspective. The second molecule we're developing here at Noema is called not 102, but 105. We call it NOE 105, and its name is gemlepodect. And it is a molecule that's very interesting. It's focused in a special part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which affects movement and speech. And so we felt it was appropriate then to study it in disorders where those are an issue. And we know that the biology very much matches also the effect that the drug has on a specific enzyme in the brain. So we finished a study up in an indication called COFD. The lay term for that is stuttering. But we also have results in Tourette's syndrome, and we're moving to a large study globally, also looking at NOE 105 in Tourette's. We have 2 other molecules. Actually, I just want to make it a little bit bigger. I know what the next is. It's 115, and again, not 106. This is medicine that we think has good potential for addressing symptoms of vasomotor issues with women who have menopause. So we're talking here about night sweats as well as hot flashes. And there are new drugs coming onto the market for these, but we feel we also have an approach with an additional molecule we have. And we have a small study that's now running in the United States where we're enrolling women who are in menopause, who have these VMS, vasomotor symptoms, and looking at the effect of the drug. The final one, we're doing a little bit more non-clinical or animal work on, so we can make sure we can pick the best population and patients who may need it and focus. So that's a little behind the others. Again, you can see a broad number of medications. Usually we don't have companies our size taking on such large indications and large programs. But in both of these cases, we're able to form close relationships with advocacy groups such as the FPA, which is important to us, not only in designing the trial, but certainly in getting the trial done, but also certainly sharing the benefits, hopefully, that'll come from it. So let me stop there. Certainly, you can visit our website. There's more information for you there if you'd like. And I'm going to stay around. So if there's any additional information that folks want, then feel free to just reach out during the Q&A. Again, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Rob. Okay, so now, first of all, thank you also for this opportunity to share this information about this trial and to learn from your experiences. And we are very appreciative of that for sure. I'm going to spend just a little bit of time explaining the trial itself, just so you understand what the scope of the trial is and what it actually entails for a patient. But before I get there, I just want to explain just really quickly about something Rob already mentioned, which is the mechanism of Basimglurant. And not to get too complicated here, but basically, this receptor mGluR5 has been associated with upregulation, so it becomes more prominent in the signaling pathway when there's nerve injury. So these were preclinical experiments in animals showing that this signal, this biological signal of what happens when people undergo a pain like this, nerve injury specifically. And I somehow got rid of the slide. Anyway, it seems like there's a missing slide, but either way, the idea is that this is the sort of end pathway. This is the damage pathway. And the idea is, regardless of the individual patients, how their treatment, how their diagnosis of TN occurred, as we know, it can occur from different experiences. We believe that the common pathway in trigeminal is this mGluR5 pathway. So Basimglurant is targeting this pathway as a way of reducing the signal that is being generated in trigeminal neuralgia and thereby reducing overall pain. So this is I had another slide that showed a little more detail, but essentially it binds to mGluR5, so it's a specific receptor. It inhibits mGluR5, thereby reducing the signaling, the pain signaling. This signal has been showed in multiple preclinical models, and so Basimglurant may represent a truly novel treatment, and it's the basis for our for the study that I'm about to show you. So that's just a little bit about how it works, and let's talk about what the study actually looks like. The study is called the Libra study. It's a double-blind study, which means that nobody during the critical phase, the double-blind phase, nobody knows what treatment assignments the patients are on. That includes the patients, the doctors, Noema, ourselves. No one knows during that. That's what double-blind means. And it's to evaluate the daily dosing with Basimglurant from 1.5 to 3.5 milligrams in patients with trigeminal neuralgia who aren't responding to their current therapy. The goal of the trial is primarily to look at how well Basimglurant reduces the number of episodes or the severity of paroxysms or pain attacks, and also importantly to understand the safety profile. So we often refer to these as efficacy and safety profiles, and that's what the main goal of the trial is. We'll also obviously be able to look at other aspects of efficacy, so other things that may improve, and that's where we've learned a lot from speaking to trigeminal patients and understanding what are the impacts on their daily lives. It's not just a reduction in paroxysms per se. There could be other benefits if the medicine's effective. So just very high level, the study has 4 phases. The phases are first the screening phase. I'll go into these in a little more detail, but there's a screening phase where people are evaluated for eligibility. Then there's an open label run-in phase, which means that patients in this period, period 1, which is not the double-blind phase, will know that they're taking Basimglurant. The point of period 1 is to to dose patients with Basimglurant for 8 weeks in order for them to demonstrate efficacy. So patients who do demonstrate efficacy, that is, they respond to Basimglurant over this 8-week period, are then randomized to either continue on Basimglurant or receive placebo or sugar pill in a 1-to-1, so a even 50-50 chance of receiving either of those. And that's the double-blind phase. That's the phase no one will know what assignment patients have been allocated to. Following the double-blind phase, there is what we call an open-label extension, and that means that patients who successfully complete period 2 will be eligible to participate in this trial. And in this trial, everyone gets open-label Basimglurant. That is, everyone will know, the doctor, the patient, everyone will know what their patient is getting. And the idea there is for patients for which Basimglurant works to control their pain, they will have access to the drug for up to 52 weeks, a year, essentially, after the trial ends. One more thing to note, in period 1, another important component of period 1 is dose escalation. This drug has to be dosed in escalating fashion over 4 weeks. And so that's the time that we do that, to get patients on a stable dose and then to demonstrate, for them to demonstrate efficacy. Let's just dive in a little bit into some of these details. First of all, in terms of eligibility, this is not the only list. These are the very, very high level eligibility criteria, and this helps to define the treatment population in the trial, which is important to make sure that the treatment population, number one, has the severity and the condition and severity that we expect, that's protocol specified, that they're in the same range, and also that they are all in some ways a homogeneous group, so that at the end of the trial, when we see the data, we can refer to, we can understand how to interpret it. So here are some of the very high level highlights. Patients have to be between 18 and 75, have to suffer from idiopathic trigeminal neuralgia, and they're not fully benefiting from their current therapies. They may not be eligible if they suffer from secondary trigeminal neuralgia, if you have significant uncontrolled, unstable medical conditions, or if you've been recently diagnosed with a cardiovascular disease. And these are intended to ensure that when we look at the data at the end of the study and we have the safety signal, we want to make sure that hasn't been confounded by a pre-existing condition. So that's some of the reasons why we require some of these. And again, these are just very high level. And of course, keep in mind that these are just requirements, but the real determination about whether you're eligible to enter the trial will be made by the discussion with the study doctor after he or she has access to your information, and you've both established that it's a good idea for you to participate in the trial. There's the clinicaltrials.gov summary of the trial, which you can go look up, and it has all the fun things in there, including the sites and including some of the things I've talked about here today in terms of the objectives of the trial. One of the things we include here, just so that people understand technologically and operationally how we do conduct the trial, we use a electronic pain diary, which we call TNED. And we're not going to get into the details here, but essentially, we try to make it easy for the patient to be able to capture the relevant information that we need. And here you see some of the main buckets here, which is the number of attacks, the severity of each attack, how it interrupts your daily activities. For patients that have continuous pain, how long is that pain? And then, of course, what the severity of that continuous pain is. So we try to make it easy. We try to make it adaptable to patients' lives. And we also are obligated to ensure that this data is accurate and correctly captured. And so when we look at the data after, we know that it's accurate. So that's just a little bit about that. I already talked about the screening phase, this 4-week phase where the doctor will ask you questions about your medical history, other medical information, and of course, they'll assess your severity of your condition. You'll be asked to sign an informed consent, which will describe everything about the study in language that you can understand, including the tests or procedures, blood draws, etc. And patients who are eligible and agree, this is the first stop for the trial. It's the screening phase. Some medications will have to be stopped specifically for pain and reduce. Others will be allowed during the trial, as I'll get to in a minute. And so this is the screening period. It's the time where we evaluate the patient, or the doctor evaluates the patient for eligibility in the trial along the lines I just described. The run-in phase I alluded to before. Patients are taking this drug once daily, preferably with food, and patients start at the lowest dose of 1.5 milligrams per day, and then they're increased 0.5 milligrams each day to a target dose of 3.5, and also a maximum dose. Patients are able to stop at a given dose if their tolerability allows for it, and that's what the doctor will do with the patient in terms of assessing their tolerability during the titration phase and after. We have follow-up. We try to make it as easy and convenient for patients as possible. Sometimes there are several times the patients have to come into the study itself, but we try to minimize that as much as we can. Importantly, as I mentioned, that period 1 is intended to establish efficacy. That means we have to see that the drug is actually working in the patient. The patient has to respond to the drug and have it be tolerable in order for them to be eligible to enter period 2. Remember, which I'll get to in a second, period 2 is the double-blind phase, and we can't very well understand efficacy if we don't start at baseline with a robust efficacy response. Then we look for the loss of that efficacy over period 2, which I'm going to get to right now. So in period 1, patients that have minimal side effects, tolerable side effects, and who have benefited from the drug and want to continue will enter period 2. They'll be randomized, as I said, randomly assigned to receive either basimglurant or placebo for up to 12 weeks. Nobody, including the patient or the doctor or the sponsor or anybody, will know which drug they're getting. And importantly, which Rob alluded to right at the beginning, which is in these types of trials, we try to include as much real world conditions as possible. As if anyone who's participated in pain trials before knows, one of those challenges is being able to allow for use of pain meds during the trial. And it's always kind of butting heads in terms of weighting the value of the data with allowing potentially someone to take another pain med. Well, in this trial, we allow for a number of what we call rescue meds, which are pain medications that are allowed on for short-term use to potentially give patients relief during the double blind. There are some drugs that are strictly prohibited. And so you'll want to make sure to talk to your doctor about that. So this is the double blind period. As I said, patients who complete the double blind period, that is, they complete the double blind period, will have the option to enter into an open label extension. Open label means everyone knows what the treatment assignment is, including the dose. So everyone knows that the patients are getting what they're getting. And obviously there's flexibility for continued dosing, up titration, down titration. So the OLE is an open label type of phase of the trial. And we try to do follow-ups during this 1-year component of the trial as infrequently as possible, but it's basically every 3 months. At the beginning, the doctors evaluate the patients a little more closely because remember, patient could be coming off of placebo condition for up to 12 weeks. So have to make sure that when they go into the open label that they're getting active drug. We want to look at them a little more closely at the beginning there, but generally every 3 months, and then there's a safety follow-up at the conclusion of the trial. Okay, importantly, this study has been going on for some time. And you see here where the study sites are in the US and abroad. Here we're focused on the US. We have 4 sites in the US, as you can see. And here are their contact information. In terms of the number of sites, these sites, as you can see, are spread across the country. These are doctors that have been selected based on their experience with trigeminal. And just want to say that if one of these is not near your region, keep in mind that there are options to go to one of these sites that Noema might be able to help with in terms of traveling to one of these sites on a case-by-case basis, of course, but we do have opportunities to facilitate participation for patients in the US, at least, to get to one of these sites. And that's all we have. And again, thank you for your time tonight. And thanks for the opportunity to share the details of the trial. So now let's open it up to some questions.
Thank you so much, Rob, Dr. Lasser, Denise, for an excellent presentation. It was so informative, and there are several questions from the audience. I'm going to kick it off, and then I'd like to get to as many as we can while we're here.
Sure.
Let me switch it over here. Thank you so much.
You want me to stop sharing, Brandy?
Yes, you did. It's perfect. So,
oh, you want me to keep? Okay.
Oh, no, you're good. Not sharing, but if someone does have a question and you want to show a slide, certainly can bring it back up.
Sure.
So in addition to tonight's webinar, and I can't thank you enough for being here with us this evening, you all have shared information about the clinical trial at FPA support group meetings across the US over the last several weeks. During those meetings, you asked patients questions about how facial pain affects their daily lives, not only as just a measure of pain, but, emotionally, fear-based, all of that. You asked a lot of great questions. And you mentioned you also mentioned during the presentation that you've been asking those questions. Can you share a little bit about why you ask patients about more than just their pain, and then the impact that kind of has on the trial, as well as maybe some things you've learned by listening to patients and hearing their perspective?
I'll go first. Yes, we have heard a lot. The question was, why do we ask the questions? One of the reasons we ask the questions is to understand beyond symptom control what truly makes a difference in patients' lives. As you can imagine, in different medical conditions, the concerns are different, and they don't have to do with the primary underlying conditions such as attacks or seizures in the case of TSC. But in the case of TGN, what we've learned is that there is a anxiety component, not anxiety, and Rob can definitely describe this as he's a psychiatrist, but there's a fear of experiencing the next attack. And there are several fears associated with that, and that tends to complicate evaluations of whether a drug works or not, because there are the components to the condition that could obscure the actual efficacy and the actual evaluation of the data. We also ask these questions because we want to make sure that when a drug is available to patients, that they have a tangible, and again, the profile is what defines this, that patients understand more, patients that want to look in and understand the drug more, they can understand practical applications of efficacy to their own lives. So, and that's not something you always see or get to talk with your doctor about, because it's your own concern. And that's why we want to make sure that there's a sort of robustness of the effect. We don't have to want to describe what the effect is to the extent that it's not sort of intuitive to patients. So things like what we've learned over and over again is how facial pain, how trigeminal and the attacks interrupt regular daily lives, interrupt things like, here's something that I found really fascinating. People say they won't go out to dinner. Some people won't go out to dinner because being in a certain spot in a restaurant can trigger their neuralgia, their attacks, and therefore they avoid going there. And if you sort of follow the trajectory of patients as they the longer they're suffering from this, you see that their lives become smaller and smaller and smaller because that's their coping mechanism to try to head off the attacks. And so I've always been fascinated in this area with, how do you quantify that? How do you show that you're actually expanding your zone of living, essentially? So I'll stop there because I could talk forever. I'll let some of the other folks talk, but that's really what we learned.
Like your life expands beyond your experience with facial pain.
Right. First, it restricts, and then the idea is, how do we get these patients to have a larger scope, larger sphere of life. Think about it. So, and that's something that was surprising to me. Not surprising, but that I've learned over the last few months of doing this.
Thank you. In those support group meetings, there were also patients who expressed, either they were unable to stop their medication, either because, even if it wasn't working fully, right, it was giving them some relief, or not even providing complete relief, but they were afraid the pain would become worse if they
Yeah.
stopped taking their medication. Do patients have to stop their medication? Does it depend on the medication? And then, is there anything that you all have that helps patients as they, make that transition to trying out a new drug with the clinical trial?
That's a really good question. The question is yes, there are some drugs that are restricted in the trial. So TGN is one of those conditions where there's not a lot of effective medications, and so people tend to try different pain meds because there's obviously a whole panoply of pain meds, opioids, non-opioids, pregabalin, etc. One of the things we've learned is that um, in trigeminal neuralgia, most of those medications don't really work. And most of those medications are, if they work, they do so temporarily. And so we've taken the approach based on feedback from trigeminal patients that we are going to allow, and we do allow, in fact, during the trial, the use of so-called rescue meds. Now, rescue meds in many, many pain conditions means that if you took the medication, that's like the available medication, that's the standard, the gold standard, and therefore you can't really continue in the trial. You've already shown that you needed another medication. The story in trigeminal is a little bit different because there are so many medications that are taken routinely that don't generally have a robust effect. And so in our trial, we've taken the very, again, naturalistic approach to say there are several classes of medications that we allow to be treated during that we allow patients to take during the trial. They're time limited, in some cases dose limited, but we allow them to be tried during the trial as a way of mitigating the potential panic from the patients or that anxiety about something's not working. There is one class of medications that we do not allow, and the specific medications, oxcarbamazepine and carbamazepine, and those are pain medications, but those medications work in trigeminal neuralgia. So for that reason, we can't allow those in our trial because they will create a confound for the primary, to create a confound for us understanding what the efficacy is. Once patient takes oxcarbamazepine or carbamazepine, we'll never really be sure if the effect is a result of the treatment, or the Grant, or this other drug. So it's sort of, we're in the middle there. Usually it's black or white, can't take any pain medications. Here, because of the unique nature of TN, because of the attacks, and mostly because these drugs aren't really, and they're not indicated, but they don't work, that's the approach we've taken in the trial.
Thank you. Thanks for answering that question. Here's a question that came from the Q&A here. Can you share more about what potential there is for drug access after the open label period ends?
So I'm
Rob,
going
you
to
wanna take
say
that
the
one?
same thing that I typed into into the Q&A, and just make it very clear. We've been working very hard behind the scenes to find some answers. I'll say, as you can imagine, we're dealing with the same drug, but two orphan conditions. Remember, we're working in both tuberous sclerosis complex as well as trigeminal. We don't want to get into the habit of picking one condition over the other. There's also an issue of drug itself. And as a small company, we've certainly budgeted for and have all of the drug to supply the OLE, as we've stated, but it may be some time before we can actually develop new actual drug to be able to help folks with after their open label extension. So we don't want to promise more than we know we have. So that's why we've been relatively quiet until we have a full counting of the drug. And imagine, we're in how many countries, Rob? 7, 8? Including India and Turkey. So there's drug everywhere. And we have to make sure we're on top of exactly what's available and make sure that we can actually supply people for as long as we will say we can. So essentially information coming. I'm actually telling you this before I talk to Ray Sakula tomorrow. So we have an early call just so he knows as well. But we are working very hard behind the scenes to make it happen. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lasser. That's very helpful. And I appreciate you answering that question, not only here during our webinar, but also in the chat. You've been very helpful and responsive. One question that came in during the presentation was from several people asking, what does secondary TN mean? When we're referring to it as secondary trigeminal neuralgia, can you help us understand what you're referencing there?
I can give one example, and Rob and Denise, if they know of any others. I think the most obvious one is there's a higher rate. It's not a large rate, but about 5 to 10%. Usually I've seen rates about 6 or 7% of people who have multiple sclerosis also have trigeminal neuralgia associated with EMS. And so it's considered secondary to the MS. It hasn't come from any kind of injury or issue there. Isn't any associated with any microvascular issues as well. And so because this can take a different sort of journey, if you think from a patient perspective, because an MS patient is different, then we exclude patients with this secondary trigeminal neuralgia due to something like MS. There's not too many other places that it's secondary, perhaps maybe to a medication of some sort, but typically it's been MS is the exclusion related to secondary TN.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lasser, for explaining that. As a follow-up question, so if someone does have, classical trigeminal neuralgia, and they've had maybe a microvascular decompression as a treatment in their past, would they still be eligible to participate in the study, or are there any medications they've taken or prior treatments they've had for their facial pain that might exclude them from
Yeah, the general rule is no. We understand that this is a long journey. The disease takes a lot of different approaches over time, and that people who have different surgical procedures don't always get the full benefit that they want, and certainly need to continue or go back to medications at some point. So everyone who's had prior surgery certainly is allowed into the trial. The only medication restriction we have is because we're studying this as a primary medication for trigeminal neuralgia, meaning a monotherapy. We know people don't usually use one drug, but in the research field, we have to study it as a single therapy. We ask people to discontinue their carbamazepine or oxcarbazine when joining the trial. We don't do it abruptly. Again, we're very sensitive and understand the issues that folks have about changing dose, right, of medication at all. And so we actually cross titrate as people are coming off of their carbamazepine or oxcarbazine. They are titrating up on basimigran, and they're also allowed to take gabapentin during that 2-week crossover period during the first 2 weeks of the study. Right? Then they continue on to their basimigran over the rest of the 8-week period. I know Rob's covered some of this, but it just sort of seems natural to talk about it. And then if you achieve that 30% response, either in severity or frequency, also the interference of the pain, then you can join the double-blind part of the study. And in that double-blind part of the study, because again, those same issues of being concerned about medication changing and the like, we allow rescue medication there as well. And as Rob mentioned, primarily that's been gabapentin and pregabalin, because I think that's what people are used to taking. But we also have some folks taking lidocaine or some NSAIDs, diclofenac, and other things like that for different periods of time. So we do permit that and understand that that is certainly a help and support because you need to complete that period 2, that double-blind period, to continue on into the open label extension. So all of that sort of gives you a sense of the access you have to different kinds of medication. We're not looking to take it away. We're just looking to test the strength of basimigran as a primary medication for trigeminal neuralgia.
That is very helpful, Dr. Lasser. Thank you so much. As you were speaking, you brought up carbamazepine, oxcarbazepine that we often hear about. Is this drug similar to those medications where it kind of slows everything down or depresses your nervous system, or is this medication, unique or different in that way?
I'd say it's not similar to the others. I mean, if you think about the rates that we've seen of things like sedation, fatigue, even cognitive slowing, I understand, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 4, even half of patients can have some of those symptoms. We haven't seen those associated with bisimgluran thus far. As I mentioned, it's a unique and distinct system that it works on, this glutamate, or we call it mGluR5 receptor or system. And it shuts down that system, but isn't a broad depressant like some of these other treatments might be, right? We have seen in the study some patients, since they're coming off of their carbamazepine, right, as we're switching over, as I mentioned, might report things like some insomnia, certainly not sedation. But they've been able to get through that, recognizing it'll happen and using the appropriate dose. And patients have been able to then just continue on as they move up in dose. And remember, we do it slowly. So it's over a 5-week period that people are moved to the top dose of bisimgluran.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lasser. And you mentioned, maybe some, very short periods of insomnia. Are there any other side effects that you've seen in the medication that you might be able to share with us today?
Beyond the ones I've said, and I sort of put in the chat, I think it's really best because folks have specific questions. They have their own medical background and the like, right? That if you really are interested, that you have those frank conversations with the study physician, because they're going to be having these with other patients. They know best about the questions you're going to ask. And they can talk to you more freely about, some of the details they've seen as well. And, you can read them for yourself, right? It's part of the informed consent where folks can look at all the things that have been reported. So I think that's best saved for follow-up when it comes to clear interest in the trial.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have the information about the different trials listed on our website. We can add that into the chat and then also at clinicaltrials.gov. But there is a question here about, is there a cutoff date for signing up for the trial if someone is interested? Would you be able to talk about kind of the timelines?
Yeah, I mean, as usual, in the world that we live in, the timeline was yesterday. So, every day is, I mean, think about it from a study perspective, the sooner that we can get this done together, the sooner that we'll be able to have results that allow us to move on to the next confirmatory stage, and really be able to tell the world about the medication and its potential. So sooner rather than later. Officially, we really would like people to give it a good, clear thought and approach a clinician, I'd say at the latest by the middle of October, understanding we're in the middle of September and people have busy lives. If you can, if you're really interested, certainly do it in the next couple of weeks. People will be waiting and wanting to hear from you. And certainly ready to take up answering your questions and getting you through screening if that's deemed the best thing to do.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Dr. Lasser. As a follow-up to that question, is the clinical trial available to people who have other conditions at this time besides trigeminal neuralgia? So, if they have occipital neuralgia or even atypical facial pain or both classical and a version of atypical facial pain, could you talk a little bit about who is actually eligible for this?
Sure. Yeah, I saw that question. I was answering in the
Okay.
chat. That's a tough one to certainly answer without knowing you. And as you know, a lot of those symptoms overlap, and it can take a very exquisite clinician to separate them all, right? And to really, be clear about separating out trigeminal from some of the other issues. So it may be. It may not be. I think that's one where, they would end up calling me and we'd have to talk about it and talk through it. Because, again, I'm having to be challenged with all of those issues is very difficult, I imagine, just as it makes it difficult to work through from a research perspective. So I would be optimistic, but I wouldn't give you a full answer. I'd have to work through it with the clinicians after they're able to talk to you and examine you.
That's very helpful. There's someone who's asking, are there a certain number of medications you have to fail before you're eligible to participate in the trial? Or, I'm going to ask kind of a follow-up question to that. If somebody is well maintained on their medication, would you recommend that they, participate in the trial?
Yeah, no, those are two good questions. Denise answered the first one, which is we don't have a requirement as it relates to, say, treatment resistance or being on many medications. That's not the issue. No, we just require that in order to be in the study, you not on oxcarbazine or carbamazepine as a primary medication, right?
Right.
So there are no numbers of hurdles you've had to be through, just like you could have no surgeries or 2 surgeries or 3, right? So that isn't any different. The one thing is you have to meet the criteria to enter the study that do require you to have a certain severity of your paroxysms and frequency of your paroxysms to join the trial. So you may be, your disease may be too well controlled to join the trial, because again, we do need to see some difference, right? When we look at the beginning and the end from people who've taken the drug versus people who've taken placebo, right? So I hope that gives a sort of a little sense of how we, balance that through. And the second question, remind me?
Oh, I was asking if someone is doing really well on their
Oh,
medication,
yeah.
would you
It's
recommend they
Yeah,
participate?
I mean, I'll answer this as a researcher and just a physician. Generally, no. I mean, if people are stable, and we love that, right? Certainly in trigeminal, we all love stability in our lives. If things are stable, I wouldn't go poking around for something new unless it's really needed. And again, if you're stable, you may not meet those criteria, right, of certain numbers of severity and frequency of the attacks in order to join the trial. So I would consider yourself in good shape. But if you do have issues, could come along in the future, tolerability, things like that, then it's important to look at other options, including clinical trials like this. But if you're stable now, I'd stay stable.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And, there are still more questions about, if someone has TN2, so that would be more continuous pain. Does having a factor of continuous pain kind of disqualify you from the study, or does that?
No, not at
Okay.
all. So thank you so much for raising that. We developed the trigeminal neuralgia electronic diary, the TNED that Rob mentioned earlier, specifically in relationship to not only FPA members and patients, but because of this very common co-occurrence with continuous pain. And so we do not only allow people in with continuous pain. It's actually making up about 40% of the sample right now. But we also measure it, of course. And so we'll be asking about, for those people with just paroxysms, the severity and frequency of them. But for people who also have continuous pain, we'll be asking about the severity of that continuous pain and the duration of it as well. So it is something we're interested in and plan to measure, and obviously are measuring as the trial's moving ahead. So thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as we're talking about kind of inclusion exclusion criteria, is there an age limit? I guess you could say on either side. What is the age range for people to be able to participate?
You've got to be 18
18
and
18 to
under
75.
the age of 76, so 75.
So you can still participate if you are 75, just
Yeah.
not 76.
Yeah,
Very
75, 11 months and 30 days-ish. Yep, as long as you don't turn 76 prior to screening.
You can turn 76 during the trial. That's fine.
Yes.
Okay, very good. And another question about, it's more around they're asking if patients have already started taking the medication. Has it, kind of gone to market? I think that's the question for anyone.
Yeah, no, and so maybe I'll spend a minute or two just letting people know about that framework and how drugs move along and where we are in this path, if you will, right? So I had talked about getting these drugs originally from Roche. They were developed by Roche, which means that they went through what's called phase 1 testing. They had first in human testing and went through different kind of pharmacology studies to see how the drug is metabolized and how the drug moves through the body. They went then to phase 2 studies with this drug and actually looked at patients who have major depression, as well as patients who have Fragile X syndrome. And neither of those studies met their primary endpoint, as it calls. And as big companies do, drug doesn't work, they put it on a shelf, right? It's just something that happens. What they often do then is sell them to other companies, work out with them how to bring it to patients, right? And then those next studies can be done. And what they are is looking in new populations. They're also called phase 2, phase 3 studies, right? Where we look at different sizes of populations. It's a little different in trigeminal neuralgia because it's an orphan condition. And so they sometimes don't put as many study requirements in place in order to move a drug to market, but certainly they have to have at least one, if not two studies that show clinical significant benefit, right? And so where we are right now is just with that first study, that first double-blind study that would show that the drug worked and was beneficial for trigeminal neuralgia. You then get into different discussions, but we'll probably do another trial that will have to confirm that finding. But at that point, we'll be moving into a large phase 3 program. It will be the first one, for a while, certainly since I think Biogen was trying to move ahead with a phase 3 program probably about 4 years ago. Certainly we'd be in more countries and offer many more spaces and come back in that context. So to make it clear about the timing, we probably do need at least 25 people, if not 35 people, over the next month or so to join. And it doesn't matter where you get screened, and if you join, great. If not, then we certainly support you and thank you for doing it, but you'll may gain some other things as well, learning about the illness and the like. I'd say if you're interested, certainly make it in the next month. We would appreciate that. But we also want to be able to, again, answer your question. So I think I was able to do that one fully, right?
Yes, that was very helpful to kind of understand each stage of the development process. As patients, I don't think that, we think of it in the way that you do as a clinician.
It's
And so it's very helpful.
the toughest part is what I left out is sort of the timeframes associated with all that, right? And so, when you have to think about, if I joined and waiting and so long, how long things take, let me, sort of put some frames around that. So this study itself has been running since 22, Denise, so 2022. So the study's been running for about 2.5 years, if not almost 3 years now. And it'll be going on for about another 6 to 7 months fully, although that's to finish it out, right? We still need everybody to come in as soon as they can now. So we'll have results, we expect, sometime in the middle of next year. And then we plan out a next study. If the study works, right, we go to the FDA, we say, hey, great first study that's worked in such a long time and so on. And then we'll negotiate with them about what the next study is and what they want to see. We'll work as fast as we can. It's usually not it's hard to get a study up and running in less than 6 months, especially when you got to do a lot of global work and drug development and supply that we need to do. But just gives you a sense again of, an additional chunk of time before a study starts. So if we start a next study, we'd probably be starting in 2026. But again, we'll be working as fast as we can. We have another, as we said, orphan condition we're working with. And they would get just as much attention. So we'll clone ourselves and make it happen. But certainly we're excited about the trigeminal program, and it's very special to us personally because you've helped us so much in designing the trial and getting it done.
Yes, and thank you so much for including patient voices and reaching out to us early on. I've known Denise for a long time, and we've been working with Noema for a long time. Even before you all launched the study, was how could you help meet patients where they are? So I want to thank you for that very much. So before we have a few more minutes, I'm trying to get as many questions as I can. As you were talking about where the study sites are, I know we have several in the US, we have several in Europe, and there were a couple of questions for people who live in either Canada or Brazil. Is it possible for them to travel to other sites if they are not within the country where you do have a site location?
And I could take that question. Unfortunately not. There's a lot of logistics between participating in a clinical trial in one country but living in another. So we cannot, and I think I answered all of the questions, but if I did not, unfortunately, we don't have anything in Brazil or Canada, and sites closest to them would be in a different country, obviously. So unfortunately, we can't at this time. But if I can, Brandy, there was a couple other questions about whether or not you need to be in the city in which the site is in. No, you absolutely do not. Rob Silva had mentioned at the start of the call, we have options to help with travel. So if you're willing to travel to one of the sites that we have, and Rob, are you able to pull up the site locations again? Would you mind? So
Sure,
folks can
sure.
maybe take a screenshot of that.
Good idea.
And it should have a contact, at minimum contact email for each of the sites. And you can reach out to them and let them know that you're interested in potentially participating. And they will go through the questions that they need answered just to see if you're eligible or potentially eligible. You can also go on at the very bottom of this slide, clinicaltrials.gov, and look up our ID, which is at the bottom of the slide, and it lists out again the sites, a little bit more background and information, and all of the inclusion exclusion criteria for the study. There's a lot, but most of them are, all of them are there to make sure that you're eligible for the study. We're enrolling the correct patients, and we're not putting anyone at undue risk. But to go back to the travel, we do have an agency that we work with that is basically a travel agency. So they will be able to schedule your trips for you where you don't necessarily have to pay for it and then get a reimbursement. We're certainly not expecting everyone to have a bunch of extra money laying around to book a hotel and a flight and then wait for or a train, depending on where you're located, and then have that reimbursed. So when you contact these sites, just let them know where you're located, and then they can work with that partner of ours to help connect you with the right people to get your travel taken care of. It sounds difficult, but I promise it's easy, and we've heard a lot of great feedback from our sites and participants that the partner that we've selected is very easy to work with and quick to respond. So it shouldn't be too problematic. Yeah.
Thank you, Denise. As you're talking about the different trial site locations and who they reach out to, could you talk a little bit about what that patient experience is like? Like, if I'm interested in joining this study, who am I contacting? And then what are my next steps? What can I expect?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And I'll go ahead and take that, and then, Rob could jump in if need be. Basically, the folks on the screen here where it says contact, those are the study coordinators. They're the right-hand person to the doctors that are noted on here. You will eventually see one of those doctors, but the first person to contact is their study coordinator. And then they will go through the questions that they have to see if you're eligible and you don't have any large exclusion criteria. Once that happens, they will more than likely schedule you for potentially an in-person screening to say, okay, we want to ask a little bit more in-depth questions, or they may ask if they could have a release of information for your medical records, any type of scans that you've had to confirm your diagnosis. And then they may wait until they get those. They may not. It really depends on the site and how they work out. But ultimately, if they feel that you're eligible, you will be asked to come into the site for an in-person visit. You will be given a consent form, and you will be asked and given as much time as you need to review the consent form. And then a member of the staff, more than likely one of the physicians, or if there's a nurse practitioner or a clinician, will go over the consent form with you. They will answer all of your questions, take all the time you need. And it's not the only time during the study you'll have to ask questions, but it's certainly the first time that you have. If you're still interested, then they will have you sign that consent form. And then at that point, they'll move into more direct questioning. There'll be labs, an ECG. The first visit is kind of long, and so they do let you know you'll be there several hours. Like as I said, there's blood draws, there's an ECG. We want to make sure that everything on the inside is working correctly too, and there's not something that we're missing. And then after that, after your labs and everything come back, the site will schedule you for your first what's called a baseline visit. And that's the day that you will be given study medication at the lowest starting dose. And then you'll be contacted weekly after that, and you have to come back in at 8 weeks, and then it continues forward. So although there are a lot of visits, if you will, there's only a handful of in person. The rest of them are all telehealth visits that will be done either, through an iPad, through your computer. The TNED diary we were speaking of at screening, you will either download it to your phone, or if you're not comfortable with doing that, the sites do have a device, which is basically another cell phone that has no other capabilities other than completing the diary and the questionnaires. And they will teach you how to do that. They will get you logged in with your account, and you'll start that at screening, because you need to enter all of your pain data, and the questions will pop up. You'll get a reminder. It's really quite simple to use. And so that will start at screening, and then baseline is when you get your first dose of medication and continue forward with that. The sites will go over all of this. They will schedule the best that they can around your schedule. I can't speak to the site's availability nights and weekends. Some of them certainly have that. That's something that they can all talk about. But I hope that was helpful. It was a lot of words, but ultimately you'll be walked through every step of the way. The sites actually have a handout that they can give you that explains every single visit, what's going to happen at that visit, and then contact information for the site that you end up participating with, who you can call. Every one of these sites have a 24/7 line, an on-call physician if need be. So you're never going to just sign in and then just kind of float through. There will always be somebody for you to connect with and answer your questions and concerns. So I hope that was helpful.
That was so helpful and very comprehensive. And I really appreciate it, Denise, especially talking about, the obligation or commitment at that first meeting, but then being able to access it via telehealth. I think that's very important, especially for our community where, when you do travel and Rob was sharing earlier, people being afraid to go into spaces where, if a fan or a ventilation can trigger their TN. So that's very thoughtful in your planning for the study that you considered those things, and we're very grateful.
Absolutely. And we tried the best we could to make the required in-clinic visits the ones that we absolutely need you in person, which would, vital sign collection, blood draws, ECGs, giving you your medication. It was with a lot of help, Randy, from you and your team, and talking to, folks that have participated in studies before. And we know that everybody's quite busy and wanted to make it as less burdensome as possible. Everybody has enough on their plates. We don't want this to be another burden.
Absolutely. And when we work together, I think people with these conditions like facial pain can be best served. So again, grateful for the partnership we've had over the last several years. We're just after the hour here. Any last minute thoughts? I just want to thank everyone for coming this evening to our webinar. This is all recorded. We'll be sending out an email within the next week. It'll also be on our website. So stay tuned for more webinars in October. And as a friendly reminder, we will be launching our new book on October 1st. And thank you everyone again for being with us tonight. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.